Alright, so today I want to introduce you to the Shatter gene in ball pythons. And if you haven't heard of the Shatter and you're not familiar with the gene, I'd say it's not very surprising. There's not a lot of people working with Shatter. And as a matter of fact, if you go over to morphmarket.com, there's not a lot of Shatter combinations that have been posted over there. And essentially what Shatter is, it's a genetic paradox. And what a paradox is it's actually a spot on your snake that is unexpected. For example, if you were breeding pinstripes and you hatched out a pinstripe hatchling that had a black spot on it, that would be a paradox pinstripe. And I'd say in most cases, the paradox is not genetic. So if you grew up that pinstripe paradox and you actually bred it to something else, none of the offspring would be paradox. It's just kind of a random occurrence. But in the case of Shatter, it is genetic. As a matter of fact, it's a codominant morph, and 2 copies of the gene gives you a super. And believe it or not, someone has produced a super Shatter, posted it over on Morph Market. A lot of people were wondering if you can actually produce a super Shatter. And kind of the interesting thing, and I'd say one of the most difficult things about the project, is if you're actually breeding a Shatter through your collection and looking at all your offspring, expecting Shatter combinations, and you randomly popped out a paradox, you could be tricked into thinking that that paradox offspring was actually a Shatter. As a matter of fact, I saw a video where a guy bought a hatchling that was supposed to be a Shatter hatchling, and it turned out to be a paradox. And he actually grew it up and bred it through his collection. He got no Shatters. And as far as I know, here in 2026, there are no genetic tests available for the Shatter gene. So that is kind of a challenging part of the project. The other thing is, I've heard some people breeding Shatters will actually see a brightening effect in some of their snakes, bringing out yellows and oranges. And some people say that one way you can maybe tell if you have a Shatter is underneath the mouth, underneath the head, on the bottom of the mouth, like from the tip of the nose all the way to the neck. A lot of times it'll have like a really narrow black stripe under there, which is pretty fascinating. I saw it in a video and I was looking all over Morph Market for someone who would actually show the picture of that little stripe under the head, and I couldn't find one, but I thought that was pretty fascinating. And according to that video, he said that in some cases you'll see the stripe, and in some combinations it'll disappear. Some combinations you'll still see that little stripe right under the jaw of the ball python. So what I'm going to do today is I'm going to jump over to Morph Market. I want to show you what the Shatter looks like. I want to show you what it actually can do, mixing it into other combinations to show you the potential of the Shatter ball python. Alright, so I'm going to jump over here on morphmarket.com, and I want to start with this snake right here. This is a normal wild type ball python. I kind of wanted to give you a baseline reference as far as what you can expect the Shatter to do. So take a look at this. This is what a normal looks like, and here's what happens when you add Shatter to a normal ball python. Take a look at this. This is a really extreme version of Shatter. And when it comes to Shatter, I would say there's different degrees of Shatter. It seems like there's different lines of Shatter. As a matter of fact, a lot of the ball pythons over here, some of them are listed as possible Shatter because they're really low expression Shatters. And I work to try to pick out some of the most extreme versions of Shatter over here on Morph Market. And the paradoxing is kind of interesting because with a paradox, a lot of times you'll see like one little patch in a paradox, and with the Shatter it seems like it covers a lot of the snake in a lot of the cases, and it can be really confusing. Do I have a paradox or do I have a Shatter when you're actually producing these offspring? And a lot of times it'll really mix up the belly pattern of the ball python. So a lot of times if you're breeding something where you're relying on belly pattern identification, a lot of times when you add Shatter in there, you won't see the typical pattern on the belly. It'll completely shatter that pattern. And sometimes it'll actually come up on the head where you see some kind of paradoxing on the heads. Sometimes it actually will strip away some of the color of the snake and show a color underneath. It'll like strip away the top layers, and you'll see like so for example, if you actually had like something with pastel in it, it would strip away the colors on top and then show the pastel underneath, which is pretty cool. So take a look at this snake. This is actually the super Shatter. Someone actually produced a super Shatter. 2 copies of the Shatter gene in a normal ball python. So that is pretty amazing. You can really tell it really reduces a lot of the pattern. It really brings in a lot of this pixelation and the different colors all along the snake, which is pretty fascinating. This one actually sold for $500. These are still selling for pretty good money over here at Morph Market. All right, so I wanted to show you the Shatter mixed in with some other genes, and the first one I wanted to show you is the pastel. This is what a pastel looks like without the Shatter. And kind of the interesting thing is if you're breeding Shatter through your collection, a lot of times if you have a low expression Shatter, it can kind of trick you because you start looking at this and you're like, well, is Shatter in there? I see a little bit of a spot on the side of the snake, and sometimes, you know, people are listing these as possible Shatters. But let me tell you, when you actually have a high expression Shatter, take a look at this, what it does to the pastel. This is a really extreme version of Shatter in here, and you can see it. It does really look like a paradox with these black spots on the pastel, which you normally wouldn't see. And a lot of times on these snakes, you'll actually see a little bit of color coming up on top of the head that's normally not there in a lot of your ball pythons. So you'll see it kind of creeping up the back of the head. Sometimes it comes all the way to the top of the back of the head. A lot of people identify Shatters by just the random color coming up on top of the head, which is pretty fascinating. All right, so I wanted to add calico to the mix, pastel and calico, and then we'll add Shatter on top of it. This is what a calico looks like, and calico can be really variable too. Sometimes you'll have a really low expression calico, and sometimes, like in this case, you'll have a really high expression. As a matter of fact, in my collection, I breed calico, and I'd say my version is a really low expression, but sometimes you'll see some really dramatic effects, especially if you mix it with bamboo. It can have some dramatic effects. But let me tell you, my calico pastels do not look like this. And my version of calico actually brings in a lot of amber color, kind of like a rusty brown, almost like a burgundy, kind of like a rust color, which is kind of interesting. And this one seems to bring in some yellow too. So here's what happens if you add calico to just pastel. You get a pastel calico. And again, if you look at this, especially if you're breeding Shatter through your collection, it almost looks like you could pick out, you know, possible Shatter in this, but there's no Shatter in this one. Sometimes it can be really confusing. And here's what happens if you add a high expression version of Shatter to your pastel calico. Take a look at this crazy snake. This is pretty amazing. This was unexpected to me, that the Shatter could actually completely dissolve the pattern on parts of the snake. That is a pretty strong influence from one copy of the Shatter gene. And let's see, this one was hatched in 2022, sold for $600. All right, so I wanted to add one more gene to this mix, and that is the yellow belly. So yellow belly by itself is kind of an interesting snake. It works really well with genes in the yellow belly complex to make the highways and the freeways. And the yellow belly can be a little bit yellow, can have a yellow belly, but in most cases it looks almost like a normal snake. Sometimes you can actually see a little bit of checkering on the sides by the bottom of the belly, like you see in this one. That's actually part of the yellow belly complex. Sometimes you can identify them that way. But if you add one copy of yellow belly to some of your brightening genes, it can brighten them even more with just one copy of the yellow belly. So take a look at this. This is actually the pastel yellow belly calico, really bright snake without the Shatter gene in here. So this is a really awesome snake. And here's what happens if you take this snake and you add the Shatter to it. Take a look at this crazy snake. This actually completely shattered the pattern. This kind of blew me away, that a single gene of kind of a genetic paradox could actually just kind of completely shatter the pattern like this. This is pretty amazing. I would have not expected that from one copy of the Shatter gene. All right, so I wanted to get in some really visually dominant genes. It's interesting, the Shatter can actually break through even the most visually dominant genes, which a lot of genes get completely covered when you're mixing it in with certain combinations. So here is the champagne, and the champagne, I'd say, wipes out most of the pattern of all your snakes. As a matter of fact, almost anything you breed with the champagne, you'll end up with like a solid colored snake without any other pattern. Sometimes you can change the color of the champagne, but a lot of times it'll actually wipe out all the pattern. So here's what happens if you take Shatter and you mix it in with the champagne. Take a look at this. And this is a little bit tricky over here because sometimes I think champagnes can kind of tend to have paradoxing in your champagnes. And on this one, it's kind of interesting because you see quite a bit of paradoxing, and they're actually listing this as a Shatter champagne over here. So So yeah, you know, it kind of comes into question, do I really have a Shatter champagne? You know, if you see the paradoxing, because you look at a lot of champagnes and a lot of times they'll just have random paradoxing on the champagnes, and it can kind of trick you into thinking you may or may not have paradoxing versus the Shatter gene. And with no genetic test, it's a little bit difficult too. So here's another gene that's really visually dominant, the banana. And the banana is pretty much the same thing as the coral glow. And when it comes to banana, it'll like completely absorb all the other colors. As a matter of fact, I've produced quite a few pastel bananas, and I'd say unless they're like hatchlings right out of the egg, a lot of times you really can't tell that the pastel is actually underneath the banana. It will completely cover it. If you mix it with certain genes, you can see the pattern coming through, but a lot of times the banana will kind of cover up all the other color of the other genes. And here's another visually dominant one, is the pinstripe. So the pinstripe mixed with the coral glow, you'll actually see the color of the coral glow, but you'll see the pattern of the pinstripe. They're both really visually dominant and hard to break through, especially the color and the pattern. And here's what happens if you actually take a coral glow, mix it with the pinstripe. This is what you get. You get a coral glow pinstripe, and it's a little bit deceiving on this picture because these, you know, the coral glows can be really super bright and high contrast as hatchlings, and a lot of times they will completely fade out as adults. But you can actually see on this one, you see two visually dominant genes in the ball python. So here's what happens if you add Shatter to a pinstripe coral glow. And take a look at this. You can tell the snake is a little bit faded out because it gets, as they get older, they kind of fade out a little bit. But you can actually see that the Shatter is actually breaking through the color of the coral glow, which is absolutely amazing. It can break through the coral glow. It can break through the champagne, which is really incredible. I found that pretty fascinating, that a gene can be, you know, break through even the most visually dominant genes. All right, so here's a snake that I just kind of randomly ran into. I actually found one over here with Shatter in it that was like this. Take a look at this. This is like one of the most incredible snakes that I have ever seen over here on Morph Market. This is actually a Super GHI Mojave, and take a look at that beauty. That's like the darkest dark I have ever seen, with this beautiful stripe coming right down the top of the snake. That is something I want to make. Just looking at this snake, that's an incredible snake. I've never seen anything quite like it. And here's what happens if you add Shatter to this snake. This completely blew me away. Take a look at this snake, the big snake up here on top. Look what the Shatter did to it. It actually took the stripe on the top, and it like kind of exploded it all over the top of the snake, and it actually kind of dripped it down the sides. And look at the color of this. The head is like a metallic gold color. That is pretty fascinating. The kind of the weird thing about this snake is the breeder wasn't quite sure what this snake was. As a matter of fact, down here he listed it as a he thinks the parent, this is the parent, the big one. He thinks it's a Super GHI Mojave Pastel Shatter. But I was looking over here on Morph Market. It seems like if you actually add Pastel in with the Super GHI Mojave, that you really lose a lot of the darks from the really dark snake. This is this snake really blew me away. This is the most amazing snake that I've ever seen. So I'd say this is pretty much the ultimate potential of the Shatter Ball Python gene. All right, so it is time for the question of the day. And USMC asks, when you have a hatchling that's fresh out of the egg and has eaten 5 mouse hoppers, should you keep feeding mouse hoppers or should you transition over to frozen thawed? And that is a very good question. As a matter of fact, when I first started in ball pythons, I hatched out my very first snakes, put them up in my hatchling rack, and usually you have to wait until they shed for the first time before they'll eat. And once they shed, I tried absolutely everything to get those hatchlings to eat. I could not get them to eat. I tried frozen thawed mice, frozen thawed rats. I even was breeding rats at the time, and I tried these little tiny rat pups, and they would absolutely refuse every meal. As a matter of fact, I think only 2 out of 40 would eat a rat pup, so it wasn't very good success on the rat pups, but a couple did eat. And I went to the pet store, and I was totally exasperated. And I was like, what will these ball python hatchlings eat? And he said live mouse hoppers. And basically a mouse hopper is just a tiny little mouse, just barely big enough to start hopping around. That's why they call them mouse hoppers. and he was actually selling them. I think he sold them for like $3 a piece for something like that. It was really expensive for 40 mouse hoppers. So I bought 40 of them, brought them home, and to my surprise, almost all of my ball pythons ate for the very first time on live mouse hoppers. And usually what I'll do is I'll breed my own mice because it's a lot more economical to breed your own mice. And I'll feed them usually 6 times before I'll transition to over to frozen thawed. And I actually have little stickers, magnetic stickers that I'll put on each tub that says, yes, this ball python has eaten 6. And sometimes they won't. Sometimes some hatchlings will be really stubborn, and sometimes you'll have to assist feed some of your hatchlings. So you really have to keep track of which ones are eating and which ones are not eating. But usually once they eat 6, they are really aggressive feeders, and they'll eat anything. They'll even jump out of the tub and bite your finger at that point. And at that point, you can easily transition over to frozen thawed. So that is pretty much it. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next video.